Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 11, Consciousness and the Physical World, Part 1.
We've spent the last 3 lectures looking at different theories or explanations of how our minds or brains are able to be in intentional states that are about things in the world. In the next 2 lectures, we'll turn our attention to the other major subdivision of the mental, namely the study of qualia, or consciousness more generally. In fact, the past 15 years or so have seen philosophers' attention turning towards just this topic with ever greater interest, with new journals arising and lots of conferences on the subject, and with people approaching it from many different disciplines in addition to philosophy, including neuroscience, computer science, cognitive psychology, and cognitive science. The primary questions are analogous to those concerning intentionality. Just what is the nature of the phenomenon? How can we explain it? And most of all, how can it be reconciled with the physical nature of our brains? Still, there are 2 important ways in which the study of consciousness differs from that of intentionality. First, intentionality itself is pretty easy to characterize. It's the fact that we can think about things. But part of the problem of consciousness is the difficulty of defining or even explaining what we mean when we speak of our being conscious or of mental states being conscious. And second, although we've seen that there's no clear consensus on how to explain intentionality in a physicalist way, many philosophers feel that some version of functionalism or causal covariance theory will eventually be adequate to the task. At the least, it doesn't seem too terribly mysterious how even purely physical beings might have states which represent or are about the world. We're overall quite comfortable with the idea that purely physical systems can encode information about the world. The same, however, is not true with respect to consciousness. There's no sense that the problem of consciousness is even remotely close to being solved. Functionalism doesn't help much here, if you recall Lecture 5's discussion of inverted qualia, for if, as seems possible, 2 people could have different color sensations despite being hooked up causally to the world in the same way, then purely causal role accounts of the mind just won't explain the qualitative nature of conscious experience. Indeed, the problem of consciousness seems downright intractable to many people. For that reason, it's often called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind, a term coined by Australian philosopher David Chalmers. And many people simply feel it cannot be explained how purely physical systems come to be in conscious states. If there's any good evidence for something like Descartes' substance dualism, that the mind is completely separate from the body, it would be the existence of consciousness. Or at least, that's how many people think. Let's begin by getting clearer on what philosophers mean when they talk about consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness. No, the phrase phenomenal consciousness does not mean to suggest that consciousness is really great, although it certainly is. Rather, the adjective phenomenal has an important history in philosophy that will help us understand a little more clearly what we mean by the word consciousness. We can trace the modern use of that phrase back to the great German thinker Immanuel Kant, who lived in the 18th century. In Kant's towering study of the mind and of knowledge, the Critique of Pure Reason, he distinguished between what he called phenomena and noumena. Our minds are engaged in knowing the world and the objects and events therein. The word noumena referred to objects and events as they are in themselves, independent of our mind's attempt to know them or of them. It refers to objects and events, as it were, as they would be were there no minds in existence at all to contemplate them. In contrast, the word phenomena for Kant referred to the very same objects and events insofar as they are known, insofar as they exist in our awareness or experience of them. What drives Kant's distinction here is his groundbreaking recognition that the very nature of our minds might influence how we perceive and understand those objects, and so how things are perceived by us, or how they appear to us in our experiences of them, might not quite be the same as how they are in themselves, independent of our experiences of them. Thus, phenomenal objects, objects as they appear to us in perception, must be distinguished from noumenal objects, the very same objects considered as they are in themselves, independent of our perceptions of them. So one thing philosophers mean when they speak of consciousness is precisely phenomenal consciousness, i.e., the nature of our awareness of things, including the nature of things insofar as we are aware or conscious of them, understood in a sense distinct from the question of how those things might actually be, independent of our minds or independent of our conscious awareness of them. Appearance and reality and qualia. So characterized, the study of consciousness is closely related to another classic philosophical distinction, this one dating all the way back to the ancient Greek thinker Plato, who lived in the 5th century BCE, the distinction between appearance and reality. Again, how things appear to us through our senses can often be different from how things really are. The simplest examples include cases both of perceptual error and of optical illusions. A stick placed in water will look bent when it really isn't. The moon appears larger on the horizon than when it's higher in the sky, when it really isn't. It's the same size. A neon marquee might include what looks like a moving light, when in reality it consists of a collection of individual non-moving light bulbs flashing in rapid sequence. When philosophers talk about consciousness, then, they're interested in how things appear to us, not particularly in how things in reality are. But in fact, we don't even need the funkier cases we just described to make this point, since even ordinary cases of perfectly reliable perception involve appearances as well, in all the sensory modalities, not just vision. We might say things like these. How blue appears or looks is different from how red looks. How garlic appears or smells is different from how a pineapple appears or smells, and so on. Everything we sense appears to us, in other words, has a way that it appears, or is experienced by us in a certain distinct way. Or to use the famous expression coined by New York University philosopher Thomas Nagel, there's something that it's like to experience the thing. Moreover, since how things appear is distinguished from how things might really be, how things appear may well depend crucially on the individual or the species, amongst other things. So, for example, how colors look to human beings may differ from how they look to other creatures with differently structured eyeballs and nervous systems. Indeed, how a given object's color looks to one individual within a species, to one person, may well vary from how it looks to another individual or person. And the same, of course, applies to other senses. Broccoli may taste one way to you and a different way to me, or the room may feel warm to me yet cool to you, and so on. In such cases, we're not inclined to say, one of us is correct and the other of us is incorrect, as we are when it's reality we're interested in. Rather, we acknowledge that how things appear in these cases, how they're perceived, how they're experienced, is very much a subjective matter, dependent on the subject who's experiencing them, and not a matter of purely objective reality. Our conscious experience of the world, then, has a qualitative character, a way that things feel or seem or appear, and this qualitative character is highly subjective. It's this qualitative character that philosophers are primarily interested in exploring when they talk about consciousness. Or to invoke the term for this qualitative character which we introduced way back in Lecture 1, the problem of consciousness is primarily, for philosophers of mind, the problem of qualia. And the problem, of course, is whether the existence of consciousness, the existence of qualia, can be accommodated within a purely physicalist conception of the world. In the rest of this lecture, we'll look at two very influential arguments that the answer is no. Thomas Nagel on What Is It Like to Be a Bat? In 1974, Thomas Nagel, the NYU philosopher we mentioned a moment ago, published an article with the memorable title, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? This article, which introduced the what it's like locution to describe qualia, and indeed it was perhaps this article that first got philosophers of mind beginning to think very seriously about consciousness, even as their primary attention through the 1970s and 80s was on understanding intentionality. We should also start by noting that what Nagel is arguing specifically in this article is not precisely that physicalism is false, but rather that we literally have no conception of how it could possibly be true. That's not the same thing exactly, but still, since it is a very short step from believing that we can't conceive how physicalism could be true to believing that it's actually false, that many philosophers treat Nagel as arguing for the latter conclusion, or at least as supporting their own arguments for that conclusion. So that is how we shall read him in this lecture as well. The overall style of Nagel's argument is one familiar to us from earlier lectures, for example, from Lecture 4's discussion of the identity theory. If we're interested in whether one phenomenon might be either identified with or explained in terms of some other kind of phenomenon, we explore the key properties of each. If we discover that the first has some property or properties that differ fundamentally from the second, then we've got an argument to believe that the first phenomenon can neither be identified with nor fully explained in terms of the second. And so, Nagel proceeds by discussing what he refers to as the subjective character of experience, or what it's like to be a given organism. He argues that this is always closely connected with a point of view. That is, wherever there's conscious experience, there's always some individual subject whose experience it is, who stands in a unique and privileged relationship to that experience. Thus, it's not merely that there's something that it's like to smell garlic in general, but rather that there's something that it's like for this individual organism to smell garlic, which might, of course, be very different from what it's like for some other individual organism to smell garlic. Purely physical states and processes, such as brain states and processes, to the contrary, lack this kind of subjectivity or point of view. For what physicalist theories strive for is objectivity, for discovering and describing truths which are essentially independent of any individual's particular point of view, or for discovering facts and phenomena that can be observed and understood from many different points of view and by individuals who may have very different perceptual systems. Take gravity, for example. Gravity is precisely the same thing for everyone and everything, no matter what their perceptual systems might be. And so too the brain processes that might be occurring in an individual are in principle equally accessible to everyone. The neuroscientist can even more readily discover through brain imaging techniques what's going on in your brain than you can. And so gravity and the physical brain processes are paradigm examples of objective phenomena. But that, of course, is what establishes the problem. Conscious experience seems to be essentially subjective, a matter of an individual having a unique experience to which only he or she has any direct access, while all purely physical accounts of the world, including those of the individual's brain, are essentially objective, concerning facts to which all have equal access, at least in principle. Hence, we have no way of explaining or understanding how consciousness or conscious experience might be reduced to or even related to purely physical phenomena such as brain states. For the former, consciousness, has a fundamental essential property completely at odds with the fundamental essential property of the latter, the physical processes. How can one get subjectivity, in short, merely by linking or combining a series of purely objective things? The brain in the bat. The preceding argument was rather theoretical and abstract, but it's quite vividly illustrated by the famous bat example reflected in the title of Nagel's article. Let's quote at some length from his famous discussion. Quote, "The essence of the belief that bats have conscious experience is that there's something that it's like to be a bat. Now we know that most bats perceive the external world primarily by sonar or echolocation, detecting the reflections from objects within range of their own rapid, subtly modulated high-frequency shrieks. The information thus acquired enables bats to make precise discriminations of distance, size, shape, motion, and texture comparable to those that we make by our vision. But bat sonar is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there's no reason to suppose that it's subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine." End quote. To say a bat has conscious experience is to say that there's something that it's like to be the bat, and in particular here, to say that there's something that it's like to perceive the world by sonar, much as we know by our own case what it's like to perceive the world by vision, and what it's like to see green or to see large objects, and so on. So the question then is this: given the very different nature of bat's sonar from our own visual systems, is it possible for us ever to understand or know what it is like for a bat to perceive the world by sonar? Now, Some might be inclined to say, sure, no problem. Nagel continues, quote, our own experiences provide the basic material for our imagination, whose range is therefore limited. It will not help to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms, which enables one to fly around at dusk and dawn, catching insects in one's mouth, or that one has very poor vision and perceives the surrounding world by sound signals, or that one spends the day hanging upside down by one's feet in an attic. This tells me only what it would be like for me to behave as a bat behaves. But that is not the question. I want to know what it's like for a bat to be a bat. End quote. And that, of course, is something that remains excluded from us, given that all we have to go on are our own subjective experiences, which seem to have nothing in common with what it would be like for the bat to navigate the world by sonar. Of course, nothing stops us from learning much, maybe even everything, that's physical in nature about bat sonar. Scientists, in fact, understand in great detail how sound waves work, how they carry information, how bat ears work, how the brain structures inside the bat receive and process the sound signals, and so on. They may even be able to understand, if not now, then very soon, every single step of the process, from the bat's emitting of the shriek to its constriction of its muscles to fly toward the insect it has just detected. There's just one thing that's left out of even this apparently complete, physical, purely objective account of the process of bat navigation. Its subjective nature, namely what it's like to navigate by sonar. Putting it all together, then, we've got good reason to believe that there are these subjective facts about the world, that other animals have conscious experience, that there's something that it's like to be these animals and to experience the world the way they do. And that these facts are not something we're able to grasp or conceive given the very different nature of our own physical structures and processes. And yet, it also seems clear that the objective physical facts about how animals' brains and perceptual systems work are not like this. We can know everything about those facts because knowing them doesn't require that we too can share their point of view or experience them. But if we can know everything objective and physical about other animals' cognitive processes, but we cannot grasp or conceive the relevant subjective facts about them or those processes, it follows that these subjective facts simply cannot be understood or explained on the basis of all those objective physical facts. And that, of course, sounds pretty much like the denial of physicalism, which holds that ultimately the physical is all there is. In fact, though, Nagel's argument suggests several possible closely related conclusions. First, at the least, it suggests that in addition to all the objective physical facts there are about the world, about how physical brains work and so on, there also exist subjective non-physical facts, subjective facts which seem, in invoking something that it's like to experience them, to be very different in nature from purely physical facts. You don't have to know what it feels like to have a certain brain structure activated in order to know that the brain structure is activated. Scientists know plenty about what goes on in bat brains. But you do have to know what it feels like to have that brain structure activated if you're to know what it feels like to be a bat. Second, more strongly, Nagel's argument suggests not merely that the subjective facts are different in kind from the objective facts, but further that they cannot even be explained by the objective facts. Being so different in nature, subjectivity simply does not seem to fit in with even a large, complicated set of purely objective facts, and we cannot understand why any particular subjective facts might be correlated with any particular objective facts. Why exactly should the activation of this objective brain state subjectively feel like this, in other words, rather than feel some other way altogether? No explanation seems possible. And third, and finally, Nagel's argument suggests that there simply are important limits to what we can know about the world. In particular, these subjective facts, or facts about the subjective conscious experiences of other creatures, are unknowable to us, quite literally inconceivable. We just can't know what it's like. And let's note, too, that while Nagel's primary point is to stress these differences between species, the point might well be generalizable as applying between individuals as well. Not only can no human being know what it's like to be a bat, But it may well be that no individual human being can properly know or conceive of what it's like to be any other individual human being either, strictly speaking. This last point helps make clear that Nagel's argument doesn't merely concern other creatures, other animals. The claim isn't merely that the consciousness of other species somehow raises problems that our own consciousness does not. After all, Nagel adds, we can run the very same argument based on our subjectivity, as it were. Imagine a Martian scientist whose perceptual systems are very different from those of human beings. As this Martian studies us, she would raise exactly the same questions that Nagel is raising about bats. Indeed, some Martian philosopher might well write an article called "What is it like to be a human?" word for word identical to Nagel's article, except for substituting the word human wherever the word bat appears and substituting the word vision wherever it says sonar. The points are all the same. The Martian scientist could learn much of or all the objective physical facts about our brains, but the subjective facts about what it's like for a human being to have just this brain structure activated, say, would escape her. So it's not just bat consciousness which fails to fit the physicalist understanding of the world, it's all consciousness, including our own. Now, various philosophers have responded to Nagel's argument in various ways, but since his argument in many ways anticipates an argument presented by Australian philosopher Frank Jackson a decade later, and we're going to explore Jackson's article in some detail in the next lecture, we'll hold off on looking at replies specifically to Nagel. Instead, we'll turn next to an argument by British philosopher Colin McGinn, now teaching at the University of Miami. And McGinn, similarly to Nagel, concludes that we're simply incapable of understanding how subjective facts about consciousness might arise from the purely objective physical facts about the brain. Colin McGinn's Can We Solve the Mind-Body Problem? In 1989, McGinn published this article which has much in common with Nagel's. First, like Nagel, strictly speaking, he doesn't deny physicalism. In fact, he rather explicitly argues for it, if not particularly compellingly. Nevertheless, like Nagel, he argues that we simply cannot discover what it is about the brain that's specifically responsible for conscious experience. And finally, as with Nagel, many also read McGinn as essentially providing the tools for an argument against physicalism, even if McGinn himself doesn't quite go that way, so that's pretty much how we'll treat him here. McGinn's basic argument has two stages. First, he argues that there exists some physical property of the brain that accounts for consciousness. This amounts to the argument for physicalism I just mentioned. But then second, in more detail, he argues that our mental structure, in particular the manner in which we form concepts, leaves us unable to conceive of or grasp that physical property which does account for consciousness. Together with stage one, this amounts to an argument that we're simply incapable of understanding just how the physical brain gives rise to consciousness. Let's consider each stage in turn. Stage 1, McGinn's brief argument for physicalism. Here's McGinn. Quote, resolutely shunning the supernatural, I think it's undeniable that it must be in virtue of some natural property of the brain that organisms are conscious. There just has to be some explanation for how brains subserve minds. It's implausible to take these correlations between mental states and brain states as ultimate and inexplicable facts, as simply brute. End quote. That's pretty much it. Some physical property of the brain must ultimately cause consciousness because otherwise it would be a miracle. Not much of an argument to my mind, especially since McGinn simply dismisses the possibility that the correlations between mental states and brain states might just be a brute fact. If, as Descartes observed, you'll recall from our discussion of mind-body causation in Lecture 7, if there can be brute facts about how the physical world works, why couldn't there be brute facts about mental-physical correlations? That wouldn't be any more miraculous than the laws of physics themselves, which seem precisely to be such brute facts. Miracles are what you get when laws are violated, not by the sheer fact that laws exist. We'll see far more vigorous arguments for physicalism in the final lecture of the course, but it's because the large bulk of McGinn's article concerns Stage 2, and because the argument for Stage 1 seems so half-hearted, that many read him really as providing the tools to deny physicalism, rather than merely argue that it's true, but inconceivably so. Stage 2, why physicalism is inconceivable to us. Let's consider, McGinn suggests, how we might go about trying to identify the brain property that produces conscious experience. There seem to be only two general ways of proceeding. First, we could attempt to investigate consciousness itself quite directly by introspection, by simply reflecting on our own conscious experience as we experience it. But that seems quite useless in helping us understand how the brain produces consciousness, for it amounts to observing only the consciousness and not the link between the brain and consciousness, which isn't available to introspection. Indeed, introspection itself tells us nothing at all about the brain, much less the brain basis for consciousness. For as we have seen way back in Lecture 2, when looking at arguments for Cartesian substance dualism, it's even consistent with all we get from introspection that we're just disembodied minds lacking a brain or body altogether. And in any case, introspection only gives us concepts of our own conscious experience, and not that of other creatures or species, as Nagel so vividly makes clear in his own discussion of bats. Thus, introspection surely couldn't give us any physical account of how other forms of consciousness arise from other physical brains either. So introspection seems like a non-starter. That means that in order to identify the brain basis for consciousness, we're going to have to explore the second possible route, namely the brain. But even investigating the brain gives us two possible ways to proceed. First, there's what we might call direct observation of the brain. This would include, naturally, what we see when we cut open someone's head and look. And when we do that, all we see is wet, bloody, mushy stuff, nothing remotely resembling consciousness or conscious experience. Indeed, if all you knew of a being was what you observed by cutting open its head, it might never even occur to you that the being had any form of conscious experience. The brain looks and acts more like a half-rotten melon than as the seat of conscious experience. Nor are things any different if you imagine observing the brain on a microscopic level. For all you'll see there are cells such as neurons filled with fluids and molecules and lots of electrical activity, but nothing remotely suggestive of consciousness. Indeed, Leibniz, the 17th century German thinker we've met several times, once imagined what it would be like if one were to shrink very small and explore the human brain. In his image, we'd see all sorts of mechanisms doing all sorts of things, but we wouldn't see anything like thoughts or desires or sensations. His point then was to suggest that mental properties can't be identified with any physical properties, and that seems basically to be McGinn's point now. No macro or microscopic observations of the brain will tell us how the physical brain gives rise to consciousness. Still, we might include under the category direct observation more than just what's visible macro or microscopically. We could include what neuroscientists can see by the numerous techniques available to modern science and medicine, including CAT scans, PET scans, MRIs, EEGs, and so forth. We needn't get into any technical details here, but basically scientists can now observe all sorts of activities and events going on in the brain, the patterns of electrical activity, of magnetic activity, of blood flow, the fine details of anatomical structure and function, and so on. Such direct observations are neither direct nor observations in the sense of seeing directly with the eyes, for they involve all sorts of machinery which produces results which need interpretation. Nevertheless, all of this amounts to coming to discover the physical goings-on of the brain by roughly direct measurement thereof. But can any of these explain how consciousness arises? No, argues McGinn. In Echoes of Nagel, the sorts of properties that we can observe or measure in this way just don't seem to be the right sorts of properties to explain consciousness. Many of those properties are spatial in nature. We can observe the three-dimensional structure and activities of the brain. But, McGinn notes, quote, we cannot link consciousness to the brain in virtue of spatial properties of the brain. There the brain is, laid out in space, containing spatially distributed processes. But consciousness defies explanation in such terms. Consciousness does not seem made up out of smaller spatial processes, yet perception of the brain seems limited to revealing just such processes, end quote. Indeed, we might add, there's nothing about any of those observable processes that seems even remotely suggestive of consciousness. Indeed, we might add, there's nothing about any of those observable processes that seems even remotely suggestive of consciousness. Yes, there's all that electrical and magnetic activity going on. But there's also an awful lot of electrical and magnetic activity on the surface of the sun, and nobody thinks of that as having consciousness. And yes, there's all sorts of blood flow and signaling between cells in the brain. But blood flows and cells signal in all the organs of the body, and nobody thinks of the kidney or pancreas as being conscious either. If we can somehow bracket away for a moment our beliefs that brain activity is responsible for mental activity, and look at the brain with fresh eyes, so to speak, we'd realize that none of the observable properties of the brain seem to have anything to do with consciousness whatsoever. So, the directly observable properties of the brain seem a dead end with respect to explaining how consciousness arises from the brain. That leaves us with the final possibility, that we explain how consciousness arises from the brain by using some kind of inference or reasoning. We start by observing the various physical properties in events, and by reasoning about them, come to discover that and how they produce consciousness. But is this plausible? McGinn quickly notes, quote, "Consciousness itself could not be introduced simply on the basis of what we observe about the brain and its physical effects. Inference to the best explanation of purely physical data will never take us outside the realm of the physical, forcing us to introduce concepts of consciousness. Everything physical has a purely physical explanation," end quote. In other words, all the reasoning we might do about what we observe and measure in the brain, both its causes and its effects, would remain within the realm of the physical. We might explain how certain physical things occur by invoking other physical things as their causes, and we might infer what will follow from certain physical things by thinking about their causal effects, but in no case will we ever leave the physical domain. Everything physical has a purely physical explanation, McGinn asserts, but then no amount of measurement or reasoning about the brain itself will ever introduce consciousness. This point, too, reflects some of the issues that arise with respect to mind-body causation. For all physical brain activity seems both to cause and be the effect of exclusively physical other activity, and it's just not clear how mental properties can either result from or intervene in this otherwise closed physical loop. That's a thread we'll pick up again a little later in Lecture 13. But before we do, let's get to McGinn's conclusion. McGinn's conclusion is basically this. To discover the physical processes responsible for consciousness, we must use either introspection, direct observation of the brain, or some kind of indirect reasoning about the brain, and none of these will yield what we seek. If you also happen to believe in physicalism, that some brain property is ultimately responsible for consciousness, then McGinn's argument will lead to the conclusion that we simply cannot understand what that property is or how it leads to consciousness. Or to put McGinn's own conclusion succinctly, the brain is more complicated than it is smart. It gives rise to consciousness, but not in any way that it can understand. If, on the other hand, you have no strong inclinations with respect to physicalism either way, then the bulk of McGinn's argument seems actually to give us reason to reject physicalism. For after all, if a purely physical account of things cannot explain the existence and nature of consciousness, and you're not already committed to physicalism for some reason, you've got pretty good reason to believe that there's more to the world than the merely physical, and thus to reject physicalism. As we mentioned at the start, Nagel and McGinn's arguments are very similar. Indeed, McGinn explicitly acknowledges Nagel's work in his own preface. There are, of course, a few subtle and mostly superficial differences. Nagel focuses more on the existence of other forms of consciousness besides human consciousness, bats, while McGinn is focusing just on human consciousness, for one example. But overall, they're reaching the same conclusion, that we're just not in a position to understand how the physical brain gives rise to consciousness. And they do so by very similar arguments, stressing the differences in nature between objective physical facts about the brain and subjective facts about conscious experience. And as with Nagel's argument, philosophers have had much to say in response to McGinn's. But once again, we'll hold off on those responses until we've had a chance to explore Frank Jackson's famous argument as well in the next lecture. Before we get to Jackson, though, we will introduce one more argument by the Princeton and City University of New York philosopher Saul Kripke. This is an argument against the possibility of reducing mental states to, or explaining them in terms of physical states as well, but it proceeds by very different methods. We'll start with that argument in the next lecture.
This ends Lecture 11.